So welcome along. Today, I wanted to wrap up the Seahawks draft class and just talk a little bit more about the class in general and some of the day three picks that we haven't really touched on. If you go onto SeahawksDraftBlog.com at the moment, you'll find review pieces on Rashad Penny, the Seahawks first round pick, Rasheem Green, the third round pick, and Will Disley, the fourth round pick. I've already written about Shaquem Griffin during the season. We've talked about him an awful lot, whether it was on the blog or on the podcast that we've done. That's very understandable that we covered him an awful lot during the process. So today I wanted to focus on the remaining draft picks and offer some thoughts on the class overall. So we will get into the remaining day three picks that we haven't written about on the blog. I think I'd rather talk about them here than do individual pieces, and I'll get into that and get into why I feel that way in a little while. My first message, though, listening to anybody listening to this, is just forget the draft grades. Don't read them. Ignore them. If you have been online and are reading about these draft grades and are just getting a little bit frustrated about that, just try and ignore it. The consensus seems to be that the Seahawks had a bad draft this year, and the perception for that is they didn't do one of these three things or a collection of these things. Number one, spend yet more high picks on the offensive line. Number two, draft a cornerback early. Number three, get any weapons for Russell Wilson to replace the production from Jimmy Graham and Paul Richardson. So to address these points first and to try and talk about the class in general, the offensive line, first of all, Seattle has spent in recent history the following on their offensive line via the draft. Ethan Posick was a second-round pick in 2017. Justin Britt was a second-round pick in 2014, and they gave him a big new contract just a few months ago. They drafted Jermaine Ifedi in the first round in 2016 and Reese Odiambo in the third round. And during the 2017 season, they spent a second and a third round pick on Dwayne Brown. So that's quite a lot of investment in terms of draft stock. The only team in the NFL that can claim to have spent more on their offensive line in terms of draft picks is Dallas, and possibly Tennessee with their bookend tackles. But the Seahawks have spent an awful lot on their offensive line in terms of pure draft stock. And they didn't have the cap room to do what teams like Oakland have done, for example, and sign big names, very expensive players like Kalichi Osemele, Rodney Hudson, people like that. They haven't had the cap room to be able to do that. They had to turn to the draft to try and find some cheaper reinforcements. They've spent a lot on their offensive line, and it hasn't been the solution so far. It hasn't been. And why hasn't it been? Because they haven't been able to develop some of these players that they've been drafting early. And that's the process. You know, if you're going to draft offensive linemen early, you've then got to develop them. You know, you're not picking in the top 10. You're not going to get a Tyrone Smith picking in the 20s. You've got to actually work with some players and develop them and try and create an offensive line with the players that you've got. And the Seahawks haven't done a good enough job of doing that in recent time. And that's going to be the challenge for Mike Solari coming in. And on top of the names that we've mentioned there that they've already spent their draft picks on, they have George Fant that they like a lot. They signed DJ Fluker in free agency. They drafted Jamarco Jones, who played left tackle for Ohio State in the fifth round. They've got the new O-line coach. So if they'd spent the 18 or the number 27 pick on a guard, for example, that would have likely meant cutting Fluker, who they've just signed to a bargain deal. Very, very small contract for DJ Fluker. Had a decent season with the New York Giants last year and has worked with Mike Solari before, and that will help. He's worth having at the price that he's going to cost. The other alternative is you bench Ethan Posick in the second year of his pro career, which would be harsh after less than a full year starting last year. They put him in the all-rookie team at the end of the season as well. I don't think you could really judge Ethan Posick as a good or a bad pick at this point. It would be very harsh, though, to put him on the bench and then essentially say, we're going to write off that second round pick, or we're going to assume that it's not going to work out purely for the sake of drafting this year's version of Ethan Posick. You could argue, why didn't they draft a tackle to replace Jermaine Ifedi? Because he's not had a particularly productive start to his NFL career. But then you could equally ask, who are you drafting to play right tackle? You know, this wasn't a good draft class for tackles. It was a good draft for guards and centers. That was proven with the players that went early, as expected. But there was not a great right tackle prospect, for example, just sitting there waiting to be snapped up for the Seahawks. So, listen, the Seahawks offensive line hasn't been good enough for 2 years. Nobody would argue otherwise. In 2015, they made it work. Since then, it's been a disaster, but everyone called for Tom Cable to go, or pretty much everybody, and he's gone. They've made a change there to the coaching staff. They've made an investment in young and experienced players with the likes of Brown, with the likes of Fluker, and with some of the players they brought in the draft. So they've made an investment there. And it's time to see what Mike Solari can do with this group. Change the scheme was important. Try and make it a little bit more detail-orientated. Try and get them working together as a group. Maybe make it a little less complex and complicated as well. I think that's something that's going to be important too, because it wasn't working for the last 2 years. They had to make a change. And for anybody who is going to be sitting there and criticizing the Seahawks for not addressing the offensive line early, their native third-round pick this year went on Dwayne Brown, as will their second rounder next year as well. So they did spend a high pick on the offensive line this year, just not on a rookie. They spent it on Dwayne Brown. And Dwayne Brown, as a left tackle in the league, very experienced, a leader, could help set the tone for the running game as well. That could be better than drafting a rookie early in this draft. So, I think it's unfair to say the Seahawks have not done anything on their offensive line. They certainly have with Dwayne Brown. They made some changes there. I think it may have been a time to look at other areas of the team. To the second complaint, they didn't draft a cornerback early. Big surprise. But they never do it. It doesn't take much research to see the success that they've had drafting and developing cornerbacks with a certain physical profile. You look at Walter Thurman, you look at Richard Sherman, Byron Maxwell, Shaquille Griffin just recently. They also signed Deshaun Shedd as an undrafted free agent. They signed Brandon Browner from the Canadian Football League. If there's one position Pete Carroll has shown without doubt he can develop players, it's cornerback. Furthermore, during the draft, Seattle re-signed Byron Maxwell. He's going to be coming back. So they have their two starters from 2017 returning anyway. Byron Maxwell, after a bit of a rough start, ended the season very strongly, was looking back to his old form in Seattle. This scheme seems to suit him. So that was a positive move as well there. And Trey Flowers, who they brought in, he's just their latest project, their latest shot to find a day 3 starter. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him in a while. But that's how they operate. They have a scheme which doesn't call for Patrick Peterson playing across from Darrelle Revis. If you know anything about the Seahawks, you know how they handle their business at cornerback. They're not ever going to do what Green Bay has done the last 2 years, which is take Kevin King right at the start of the second round a year ago, get a cornerback in the teens, Jair Alexander this year, and then go back and get Joshua Jackson in the second round. That's never going to be the Seahawks. They've spent one high pick on their secondary in 8 years of Pete Carroll and John Schneider being here, and that's on Earl Thomas, who's going to be a future Hall of Famer. They're not going to pump investment into their secondary. It doesn't take an awful lot of homework to realize that wasn't going to be the case. I know it's something that we considered late in the process, where they were going to look at Isaiah Oliver from Colorado as a potential early round option. In the end, it was never going to happen. They focused on the running game, and quite rightly so. And we'll address that again a little bit later on as well. And then the final point, the final complaint that you see sometimes, and that's where are the weapons for Russell Wilson? Jimmy Graham's 10 touchdowns need to be replaced. Paul Richardson's contribution is going to be missed. So what are they going to do there? Because they didn't do enough in the draft to replace those weapons. Well, I think you answer that question this way. They had 1 touchdown by a running back a year ago. If Ed Dixon and Will Disley can score 6 touchdowns between them, that's 3 each, or 4-2 split, whatever you want. Not the biggest ask, is it, between the two tight ends? You'd only need the running backs to score 3 more touchdowns than they did in 2017 to make up the shortfall. So it's not a big problem, is it? I mean, if Rashad Penny could come in and get, let's be modest with this, 6 touchdowns in his rookie season, which would be a solid number for him in his first year. And if Chris Carson got 4, or if CJ Prosise got a couple, you'd already be making up the difference from Jimmy Graham. And that's the point, is that Jimmy Graham didn't score 10 touchdowns in the red zone on top of the running back scoring 10 or 15 touchdowns as well. It's not so much that you have to replace Graham's production. It's just that you have to shift it to another area of the team. The Seahawks want to be a running team. They want to be able to run the ball in the red zone. They want to finish drives by banging it in there with a running back. They didn't do that at all last year. That's how they're going to replace Jimmy Graham's production. They're going to do it with the running game. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they're going to do it that way. But again, it's not about Graham had 10 touchdowns, the running back had 8, this receiver had another 10. How are you going to replace Jimmy Graham's touchdowns? It's Jimmy had 10, their running backs had 1, and it was J.D. McKissic in a game that was over anyway against Indianapolis, a bad team, and he kind of just ran it in there from about 25 yards. That the running back production was hopeless last year. That's the area for improvement. That's where the 10 touchdowns are hopefully going to go. And as for Richardson, well, let's not forget they drafted Amara Darboh in the 3rd round a year ago. Didn't see much from him last year, and there's going to be some pressure on him. He needs to show a little bit more this offseason. But they still drafted him in the 3rd round. He's still there. David Moore's still there. They've still got Doug Baldwin. They've got Tyler Lockett. John Brown is an interesting pickup. They brought other players in as well. Johnson from Philadelphia. I mean, they're faster at receiver this year, which is going to suit their Air Coryell style. It's going to be a slightly different offense, I think, that we've seen in the past. Mainly the same, but just a few tweaks. And when you actually look at this draft class in terms of receivers, some people inside the NFL, we quoted those Bob McGinn sources there. One of his sources called it the worst receiver draft he'd ever seen. So it's not really a fair criticism to ask why the Seahawks, again, with their limited picks, didn't go and draft a receiver early or some kind of a weapon for Russell Wilson. So when you look at the class, the Seahawks did what they wanted to do and really what they had to do, which is to get back their core identity, which has been missing for 2 years now. And it's about time that they actually did this. They need to run the ball. Forget what people say on Seahawks Twitter about the value of the running game. Forget what people say about where you should draft running backs or how much stock you should put into the running back position. There was a piece from Pro Football Talk today, again, diminishing the value of Leonard Fournette and what he did for Jacksonville and that he wasn't responsible for their jump this year. But it doesn't, stuff like that doesn't, you can't tie a number to a culture and to what the running game does in terms of attitude and how it complements a defense. And Pete Carroll's not a fool. He's won a Super Bowl playing this brand of football. And he's trying to get the Seahawks back to that. And if anybody who's lived through the Marshawn Lynch era in Seattle can't see that it can work with a large focus on the running game and a big investment there, then I don't know what to say to you. They've got to get back to this. And they drafted a dynamic running back, the one that they actually wanted in the range that they had to take him because they correctly anticipated there was going to be a run on running backs. It happened from 31 onwards when Sony Michel went to New England. Then Nick Chubb was off the board shortly afterwards. Ronald Jones II, Kerryon Johnson. These players went very, very quickly. So they got the one they wanted in the range they had to take him. They then go and get a talented pass rusher in round 3, a big need addressed in a value range, considering the dearth of options available there this year in terms of edge rush and inside out rush. There just weren't many options there. To get Rasheem Green in the 3rd round could end up being one of the big steals of this draft. That was a big need addressed there. And they got their blocking tight end, a badly needed blocking tight end to complement Dixon and maybe be the player that they hoped Nick Vannett was going to be that he so far hasn't proven to be. And then when you look at the day 3, as we're going to come on to those guys in a second, there's potentially some starters there. Trey Flowers could be a starter at cornerback next year or in a couple of years' time. Michael Dixon, the punter, could be a starter down straight away as a rookie. And everything you hear about him is positive. Jamarco Jones has got a chance to make it. Jacob Martin's got a chance to make it. Maybe Alex Magoo's going to be a backup quarterback for the years. And this draft class won't necessarily move the needle for the Seahawks to improve on 9-7 this year. I wouldn't rule it out. But the point here isn't to say this is the class that's going to get Seattle back atop the NFC. The point is that this class should help, along with their work in free agency, to regain their culture and their identity, which went missing, and to go back to a highly competitive, hungry group and set the foundations for a new run at this in the future. And when Jim Mora was in charge, the one big complaint that I had personally about that season in 2009 is that the Seahawks had no identity. What were they trying to do? Who were they? Who were they building around? What was the foundational core of that team? And if you didn't have the players in place, what was it going to be? What was Jim Mora's plan for that team? What was his vision for that team? And you just didn't see it. You saw it with Mike Holmgren. It's very clear. You didn't see it with Jim Mora. The moment that Pete Carroll arrived, he laid out his vision for this team and then executed it to perfection to the point where they won a Super Bowl. And that identity had gone. An identity in the NFL. Knowing what you want to do and being able to do it is the most underrated thing. We can talk about quarterbacks, we can talk about cornerbacks, pass rushers, whatever. We can dig out a load of analytical numbers which argue certain points and continue that forever and never be willing to be persuaded because certain numbers say certain things. Knowing what you want to be, building your team to be that and then executing is possibly the most important thing. You can win in many different ways, but you've got to know which way you want to win. If you're going to be the passing team, if you're going to be the team that throws it 50 times a game with a certain type of quarterback, then build your team to be successful in that way. If you want to run the ball and you want to be physical and you want to play strong defense, build your team to win that way. Neither way of doing it is better than the other necessarily. It's just that you've got to be able to do it if you want to be that kind of team. And for too long, the Seahawks have tried to be a running team and they just haven't been able to do it. And then they've had to try and be a passing team, but they're not built that way to succeed in that way. And now this draft class showed that they are going to get back to what they want to be. And that for me is a positive thing. And I don't really know how you can complain about that. And let's put it this way. Maybe this draft class won't move the needle. Maybe they won't be more than 9-7 this year. It might just be a more competitive, interesting 9-7 setup for the future. But if they can run the ball, and if Russell Wilson continues to perform at a high level, and considering they still have Bobby Wagner, they still have Earl Thomas, they still have Frank Clark, they still have KJ Wright, they've got some younger players coming through. Let's see what Shaquille Griffin can do in year 2. You know, they can compete with that group that I've just mentioned there. And if they can get it right on offense, you know, without a doubt, they can compete. So you certainly wouldn't rule anything out. And a lot of people talk about its transition, its rebuild. We've talked about that. I don't think Pete Carroll and John Schneider are viewing it that way. I think they fully expect to be competitive this year. So moving on, I want to talk about the rest of the class. And I'm not going to do big write-ups on each of these players. And I'm going to explain why. As I sat down to watch Trey Flowers, for example, I can find some tape of him at safety. The problem when you're scouting safeties and watching YouTube videos and not all 22 is they're often not on the screen. I found it impossible to gain any kind of insight into what he's going to be as a corner watching YouTube videos of him playing safety. I mean, it was just impossible. I could write a piece saying he's this, that, and the other, and physically he looks this way, but he's not playing corner. So what you would actually get from a big write-up about him, I don't even think I could write the piece. It just wouldn't work. What I will say about Trey Flowers is I'll come back to this in a minute. I'll explain with the others. Michael Dixon, you know, punting, again, you know, I could show you several fantastic punts of Michael Dixon. I'm not a punting expert. You know, punting is probably the hardest thing to get into a conversation about and actually do a write-up on. You know, you have to have sort of intimate knowledge of it. I have some, you know, I'm a big rugby fan. I know the differences between the kicking styles. I know Australian rules football. I don't follow it as closely as I do the rugby. I know how important kicking is in that game. I mean, if you just want a brief sort of review on the differences, in rugby, you kind of kick for territory and you kick at goal. But it's a little bit more like the NFL in terms of the, you know, kicking is not quite as frequent as it is in Australian rules football, where you're actually passing the ball with your feet. You know, you're kicking it downfield. The guys will jump up to try and call a mark and then advance the ball. And kicking is such being an accurate kicker, kicking out of your hands is vital. So I'm not surprised that there are players that are turning their hands to the NFL like Michael Dixon, and everything you hear from him is incredibly positive. So, you know, let's just say that. Jamarco Jones, I've talked about on the blog. Jacob Martin and Alex McGill, and I will come on to those players. You know, I could perhaps do write-ups on those guys down the line. But yeah, again, I think this is something that I'm going to take a bit of time on, do more detailed reviews, not crank it out this week necessarily, but I did want to spend some time talking about them in this Google Hangout. So Trey Flowers, first of all, said this on the podcast last week when we were watching the combine. He just stood out to me as someone who looked like a Seahawks corner. We watched the cornerback class. They ran slow. Their drills were appalling. Josh Jackson in particular had to stop and restart several drills. The coach was getting a bit frustrated with the group. It was an arduous session. It went on for about 3 hours. It just felt like it was never going to end. And when the cornerbacks got off, I remember personally feeling quite exhausted and ready for the combine to finish at that point. The safeties were the last group to work out. Just wanted to get it over and done with because the cornerbacks were so disappointing, especially compared to last year when they were great. And then the safeties came out. They ran faster, first of all, in the 40-yard dash, which was really positive. And then they did the drills quite well. And Trey Flowers we talked about it at the time. He just jumped off the screen as, wow, this is a Seahawks cornerback. The length, the wiry frame, the way that he moved, it was just everything about him. I could just imagine Pete Carroll's eyes lighting up. And we're not saying this after the event. We were saying all of this at the time. immediately after the combine. We put him in our 7-round mock drafts with the Seahawks. You know, he just looked like a Seahawks corner, and not surprised at all that the Seahawks had taken it. I bet Pete Carroll's pretty excited about this guy because he can coach cornerbacks, he can coach defensive backs, and I bet he feels like he can get this guy to a really strong level. And it's probably not going to happen in his rookie season. The signing of Byron Maxwell means it doesn't have to happen necessarily this season, but I wouldn't be surprised if he gets some interesting playing time by the end of the year in preparation for next year, really competing for a starting job. So Trey Flowers, I think that was a really, really good 5th-round pick, the type that we've seen this team make many, many times and have success with. Michael Dixon potentially could be Seattle's starting punter. You know, John Ryan's on a decent contract, did not end last season particularly well. Eventually, they are going to have to move on from John Ryan, who's been with the Seahawks for an awful long time now. This could just be a case of, it's competition in name, but, John Ryan's probably going to have to smash it out of the park to hold on to his job. Jamarco Jones, kind of felt that he was quite average watching him play for Ohio State. Didn't see anything in particular that really stood out. And then when you see him have the terrible combine that he had, not a big surprise that he lasted as long as he did. But I think the one thing that he has got is that he's going to be well coached with Ohio State. Seems like a very mature player. Has got that experience of playing on the blind side. Could, if nothing else, be a pretty solid backup left tackle. And the Seahawks showed last year that is exactly one thing they need. When George Fant got injured, Reese Odiomo came in and just really struggled at the left tackle position. If they can get somebody in the 5th round who could potentially be a backup / swing tackle / 6th offensive lineman from a 5th round pick, then it's worth making that kind of investment. So, whether or not he makes the team or not is going to depend. He's going to need some different conditioning to try and improve his explosive power and his athleticism, which just wasn't there at the combine, but maybe the Seahawks can work on that. Jacob Martin, I've seen a little bit of since the draft, and I just love his effort. And he's explosive. He's not the quickest, and that's maybe something that's going to hamper him. And I think we've already seen this. When he was drafted, the Seahawks were talking about him as a Leo. And I just hear more and more from Pete Carroll now talk of linebacker position. And I just wonder if they see him as, the effort and the explosive qualities maybe are going to suit him better at linebacker. And to make a little bit of a comparison here, if anybody actually goes back and watches them talking about KJ Wright, you can find, if you go on the Rain City Redemption episode for the 2011 season, you will see John Schneider talking about drafting KJ Wright in the 4th round. And when they actually drafted him, immediately afterwards, they said, yeah, we like him as a pass rusher. He could probably play some Leo for us and stuff like that. So they were actually looking at KJ Wright as somebody who could play linebacker, could play Leo. When they drafted Jacob Martin, they were talking about him immediately as a Leo. I just wonder, the way that Pete Carroll's talking now, they're actually thinking, you know what, he might be better as a linebacker. And they need to add some young depth at linebacker. They need some players there who can back up the 2 main guys, KJ Wright and Bobby Wagner. Obviously, Shaquem Griffin's going to come in and compete there too. They've got some special teams guys that they like as well, veterans. I just wonder if Jacob Martin's going to actually end up competing most this year to be a potential linebacker for this team. I would not be surprised by that at all. And I like his attitude, his maturity. He has the demeanor of a tough, hard-nosed linebacker that the Seahawks seem to like. So I would keep an eye on that as to whether or not he actually ends up at linebacker instead of Leo. And Alex Magoo, I've watched some of, and it's a tough one to judge because the best way I would describe it is I think he looks like a 7th round quarterback. And he's had a lot of praise. Pete Carroll singled him out as somebody they really liked in the first few days of camp. And people have talked about him. We've seen the stat that when things break down, he was amongst, I think it was Baker Mayfield was number 1, he was number 2, Sam Darnold was number 3 in terms of making plays when things break down. Was very highly rated by Pro Football Focus. And I think PFF actually graded him as one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the country. And don't get me wrong, there are things to like about him, but there are also things watching him that, and we haven't scouted quarterbacks in an awful long time, probably since 2012. But there were some frustrating things. There was one pass, I can't remember the game it was in, when he tried to fit it into this really small area of the field. He was going to the left end corner of the end zone, probably like a 20-yard pass. two defenders hugging that sideline, the safety helper got across, and he tried to sort of loop it in there, and it wasn't picked off. I don't know how it wasn't picked off, but he kind of just sort of tossed it up into the air, and the two defensive backs had an easy play on the ball. It was underthrown slightly. The safety came across, and I think he kind of fumbled the catch, ended up dropping it. And it was little things like that would go, okay, that's why he's lasted to the 7th round. Because you can't make that. You can't look at that throw and say, that's the throw I'm going to make. You can't just leave it up there and just toss it up there with that little velocity that he did. And he got away with it, but yeah, it didn't look particularly good. There were a lot of checkdowns in the system they ran there. Pete Carroll made the reference that he can make all the throws. There's not necessarily, in the games that I've seen so far, there's not necessarily the evidence that he's going to be able to do all of that. But at the end of the day, he's competing with Austin Davis and Stephen Morris. And this could even come down to who is the cheapest, who's going to provide the best value, who's got the most long-term benefit there. Austin Davis has got the ace up his sleeve in that he's actually worked with Brian Schottenheimer before, knows Russell Wilson, they know Austin Davis, played quite well in the preseason last year. He has actually won games in the NFL, including a game against the Seahawks at their peak. So they might feel that he's a more reliable option there to come in and fill in a season where they're hoping to be more competitive. But if they're sort of taking that sort of longer term view, then maybe Magoo could be sort of almost like a younger version of Austin Davis. I don't think there's anything particularly to get too excited about that. I mean, let's not pretend that this is some kind of, well, let's develop him and maybe even let Russell Wilson go in the future and save $30 million. I don't think that this is not that kind of a pick. This is very much I think a backup option there, somebody who's capable of making plays when things break down. I don't think this is somebody who is necessarily going to come in here and have a big NFL future, and that's why he went in the 7th round. You know, quarterbacks do not go in the 7th round and generally go on to become starters for a reason. So I'm not trying to knock him too much. I'm trying to offer a bit of reality and a bit of perspective on this guy, given he's had a lot of positivity. There are things to like, but there's probably a reason why he lasted as long as he did. I wanted to do a few Q&As as well. Thank you to everybody who sent questions in. I'm not going to get through all of them. I asked for questions in 2 separate posts. I'm just going to read questions out from the post that I posted today because they've got so many, and I want to try and do some of these justice without just sort of doing one sentence replies. So a lot of questions to go through. We're going to start with this one from Fuzzy Logic. Do you think this draft class will have a franchise-changing element that the 2010-2013 class has had? Also, do you think John Schneider and Pete Carroll have decided to go back to their original ideas they had when they started this thing back in 2010, as in basically rebuilding from scratch, minus Russell Wilson, of course? Well, very interesting question. Lots of things to get into there. So I think the first thing is, will it have a franchise-changing element? Yes, I think it will, but not in the same way. Because in 2010 to 2013, the franchise-changing element was that they were drafting a lot of talented players, making a lot of great picks in day 3. People like Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman, Byron Maxwell. You know, they were setting the stone for a Super Bowl run, and that was the franchise-changing element. It was just the original team build from scratch is what was the franchise-changing element. I think this is different. I think this is a recapturing their identity. So it's not necessarily that this class is going to bring about 5 or 6 players in the mold of the Shermans and the Chancellors and the Maxwell and people like that. It's just that I think it's just them sort of saying, we are getting back to what we were, which is, you know, not trying to force Jimmy Graham to be the complete tight end. And it's not going out and signing yet another expensive player like Sheldon Richardson and just going out and acquiring players like that. You know, we're going to get this thing back to competition. We're going to get back to running the ball. We are going to get back to what made us great in the first place. And I think that is, yes, that is going to be franchise changing. I think that's a major positive thing. So yeah, I think, and that ties in with your second part there. Have they gone back to their original ideas? Yes, I think they made a big point of that. They are getting back to what they wanted to do in the first place, which was run the ball, play tough defense, and have competition as the key to everything. Is it starting from scratch? I don't think it's necessarily starting from scratch, but I think it's just regaining their culture. So that's how I'd answer that. Chris says, Rob, when are you going to change the homepage players' pictures? Clowney, Mansell, Lee, and Sanu, I think he says. Time for a picture refresh. Yeah. A few people have asked about this. I'm planning on updating the website in time for the next season. The price of websites has changed a little bit since I got this one done, so I'm going to have to be a little bit picky and see what we can actually do. But yes, I requested my old web designer to change that image into some classic Seahawks players. Like Cam Chancellor was going to be up there in a Virginia Tech uniform, Earl Thomas in a Texas Longhorns uniform, to try and make it more timeless. He never got around to actually doing it in the end. So unfortunately, he didn't update that. But I promised that by the time the new season, the new college season starts, we'll have a few changes to the blog. Maybe a completely new look as well. We'll see what we can do. This one from Hawk Fan in MT. Courtney Upshaw was a big Seahawks draft blog favourite several years ago. Now a street free agent that's not getting much love. Any chance at strong side linebacker? I just don't think it's a big need, quite frankly. I did like Upshaw at Alabama. I think with hindsight, I don't think he was a fit for necessarily what the Seahawks wanted to do. I know he's played for Atlanta with Dan Quinn, but I don't think he's the type of player that would have fit with the Seahawks. You know, he not fast. I thought he was more of an edge rusher at Alabama rather than a linebacker. And I think what they've got at the moment with Barkevius Mingo coming in could be a very important addition there. I think he's taken that role. They've got other players that come into play. You know, they've already drafted Martin. They've drafted Shaquem Griffin. You know, they've got a bit of depth there. So I'm not sure that that's going to be an option for them. Courtney Upshaw. Go Hawks. 5151 says, what's your thoughts on what a good year for the pass rush looks like? Does it all revolve around Dion Jordan like it seems? And then he says, speaking of D-line, which of the Clemson DL quartet do you like the most? What would a good pass rush look like? I think a good pass rush would just be the Seahawks again, you know, finding ways to get the rotation going. I don't think it's dependent on one player. And I'm certainly not thinking that, you know, Dion Jordan, it's still Jordan on board. Essentially, he has to become Bennett or Averill for them to have a really great year. I don't see it quite like that. I just think it's going to be more of a team effort. So it's not going to be Averill and then Bennett and then hopefully Clark chips in. I think it's going to be a responsibility on Clark's got to get some sacks. Jordan has. Mingo has. We've got to find. I think Nos Jones is probably going to be given a bit more responsibility to go and do some pass rushing this year. Can Rasheem Green chip in? The Seahawks have never had. Clemens was the nearest thing they had to sort of a leading sack guy, someone who had the potential to get to 10, 12, get up in the charts for sacks. Since then, it's been more spread out, and I think that's going to be the way it is. I mean, it'd be great for Dion Jordan to have a good year. Hopefully, he can stay healthy. But I think more than anything, it's just like, can you find one or two guys that can come in and support Frank Clark and be consistent? And Frank Clark's going to have a big year as well. I mean, Frank Clark at times shows the most ridiculous ability, like that Rams game on the road last year, when they won. Just incredible. You know, has got the potential to be one of the best defensive ends in the NFL. But he will do it for possibly 10 games a year, 8 games a year. He's got to try and get it. He's got to be more consistent. And if he can do that this year, he's going to get paid. Probably by the Seahawks. I mean, they can't let everybody go. I know they're going to be third contracts are going to be going by the wayside now. But this will be Frank's second contract. Big year for him. So I think if I was going to talk about what is the most important thing, it's probably more consistency from Frank Clark, and it's everybody else being able to support him and chipping in and just sort of maintaining the production was there. I don't think there's a 15 sack guy on the roster. Maybe something they need to add in the future. But at the moment, I think just sort of chipping in and supporting Clark will be the main thing. This from... Oh, sorry, there's a second part to this question. Speaking of D-line, which of the Clemson defensive line quartet do you like the most? Well, I kind of like all of them. They're all very different. You know, Christian Wilkins has kind of got that cannonball sort of feel to him, a little bit of Sheldon Richardson to his game, a little bit of Grady Jarrett to his game as well. Like what he does, very tenacious, not the best production in terms of pass rush, doesn't always finish, but really gets around the field. I think Dexter Lawrence is destined to be big time. And I just love what he's done, and he makes life easier for them on that defensive front. And you do wonder sometimes how much has Austin Bryant benefited from the players he plays with, like Dexter Lawrence, who just absorb those blocks in the middle. He's enormous. He's huge, 340-pound guy, 6'5", ran a 4.61 short shuttle at 335 pounds in high school. Just a monster. Former 5-star recruit. I think he's going to be a top 10 pick if he stays healthy, if he continues to play as well as he did. So, yeah, I think Dexter Lawrence would be my favorite, but don't sleep on Clellan Ferrell. You know, he could have been a top 10 pick this year and can play a bit of inside out, could be a 3 technique at the next level. Probably the best pass rusher of the quartet. And has got the best pass rush potential at the NFL level. So Cleveland Ferrell, Dexter Lawrence, I think probably will be the 2 that I would single out from the main 4 from Clemson. This is a question from Thorson. How do you envision the Hawks will utilize Penny and Carson? Which of the undrafted free agents do you expect to make the team, if any? And are there any street free agents that might be worth kicking the tires on? I have to say, I don't see any appeal with the street free agents at the moment. Des Bryant's the main headline one. Can't see him going to the Seahawks. There isn't really. I had a look at the list in preparation for answering this question, and there wasn't anybody who jumped out. I think the Seahawks are kind of pretty much there now. They've got the 90-man roster pretty much set. Possibly a few tweaks off the back of these OTAs and stuff, but I think they're pretty much there now. There's nobody that I would certainly cover who's out on the street still. I mean, unless they could give. I mean, do they need a safety? I mean, people like Eric Reed are still out there, but it seems like he's going to go and go the lawsuit way rather than actually get an opportunity. So how do I envision the Hawks using Penny and Carson? I think that it's going to be. I think there's every chance that Chris Carson will start the year as the starter. He just looks incredible. He did look great last year. His problem has been staying healthy. I think he probably starts the year as the number 1. Rashad Penny very much close behind as a number 2. Try and make sure that neither of them get too worn out, and just try and have this 2-headed monster. You know, they kind of. I prefer the feature runner style of things, but at the moment, who is that guy for you? You know, you have to establish who that is. Carson needs to stay healthy. Maybe he could be that guy, but he has to stay healthy and stay productive. Penny has to come into the league and show that he can be what he was at San Diego State. So until that happens, maybe you do have to go with a bit of a duo or even a trio if CJ Prosise can get into that, or Mike Davis. So they've got some options there. I think it's all going to play out. Obviously, I like the fact that Carson could do some stuff in the passing game. It appears that Penny can do that too. Penny's obviously got to improve on his pass protection, but all rookie running backs not named Zeke Elliott have to do that. So I think that's how I see it initially. And Thorson says, which of the undrafted free agents do you expect to make the team? I think Poona Ford's got a really good chance. I think Pugh, the Florida State linebacker, has got a chance as well, just because they need some young depth there. And I like his explosive ability, like his length. But I think Poona Ford of all the group is the one that stands out. He's a player that we regularly mocked to the Seahawks in the 7-rounders. Love his tenacity. Love that he's. It was great to hear the Texas head coach saying to Brock and Solk on 710 ESPN today, exactly the kind of things we've been talking about with Poona Ford, in that it's actually, he's got the perfect combination that he's short, he's 5'11". It's not always the best thing to be 6'5" and actually be trying to pass rush from the interior, because people can get into your frame. And you often see a lot of these defensive tackles, they have kind of shorter arms, 32-inch arms maybe, and they're 6'4", and that's not the ideal. You want it the other way around. So Poona Ford, no one's going to be able to get under his pads because he's so short. He's 5'11". So he's going to win the leverage battle more often than not. But he's actually got long arms, so he can actually still hold people off, get into the frame, give a jolt himself, play with power. So I actually think Poona Ford could be one of the more interesting players from this undrafted free agent. I'm surprised that he was undrafted. I thought he would find a home somewhere between round 5 and 7. I thought someone would give him a chance. So that extra bit of fire, he could be the most interesting undrafted free agent they've had since Doug Baldwin. I cannot wait to see Poona Ford playing in preseason. So he's the name that I'm keeping an eye on the most. CL Bradley 17 says, hey Rob, how do you see the D coming together, the starters and the main rotation guys after all the free agent signings? It's listed some of the positions there, the re-signings of Maxwell, Jordan, Coleman, McDougall, Smith, Jefferson and Jackson, the losses of Sherman, Bennett, Averill, plus probably Cam, and the draft picks and UDFAs. Most of the offense seems fairly set, except the wide receivers behind Baldwin and Lockett. What do you think the wide receiver roles will be after those two? Brown, Darboh, Moore, and the rest. So I think the D it's essentially there. You know, I don't think I have to. I don't think there's much insight that I can really add to that. I mean, you see it. I think Mingo will be the Sam Leo type. They're going to hope for some pass rush from him probably. I think your D tackle rotation's pretty set there. They've got the two guys from the Vikings. I think you're going to see Earl continue at free safety unless there's some kind of trade. We can stop talking about that now, hopefully. Earl at free safety, McDougall 7 strong safety with Delano and Tedrick competing there as well for some time. I think that's pretty much it. Maxwell will start with Griffin probably at cornerback. battle for the spots behind them. You know, they've got their nickel with Coleman, and then you've got your pass rush rotation with the likes of Clark and Jordan and Rasheem Green. So that, you know, and possibly Martin. You know, there are some guys there. I think actually, while there's not the big names, there's not the big stars, and it's a defense that could do with depth up front and in the front seven. I don't think anybody could argue against that, and maybe that's what's going to happen next draft, which will really take this defense back up to the best it can possibly be. There is still something there. It's not a totally useless defense. It's not a, you know, you've still got stars. You've got Bobby. You've got KJ. You've got Earl. So you've got some big stars there. You've got developing players going into their second or third years, like Jaron. You've got Naz Jones. You've got Shaquille. You've got players that have got the potential to have an impact quickly, like Shaquem, with his relentless energy and his effort. So, listen, it's not going to be Sue and Aaron Donald rushing the passer up front. It's just not. But it's a defense that should, especially with the energy and the youth and the speed that they've got up there, should be competitive home and on the road. So I think there's some positivity to like about that. As for the receivers and how they're going to work out, I think, you know, you pretty much called it. I think we're going to see, obviously, Doug and Tyler Lockett's roles are going to stay pretty much the same. I think there's going to be a role for Jaron Brown there, perhaps as a deep threat. Coryell used a lot of deep concepts, play action, throw it deep, try and get over the top. I think Darbo are more the two question marks, you know, how they work into this whole thing. You know, can Darbo become maybe a number two, use Lockett more creative kind of way? That's the question for me. Can Darbo, or more for that matter, replace kind of what Paul Richardson was? So that's going to be an interesting competition to follow in camp. BC Hawks says, what do you think the Seahawks look for in a fullback? There has to be a ton of guys out there that meet the athletic minimum. Every year they seem to bring in a bunch of random guys to compete for the position. You think they pick the toughest and smartest guys who have demonstrated particular skills, or guys who have demonstrated special teams value? How tough is it to learn to play fullback for a zone blocking team versus power? Does the addition of two top blocking tight ends increase or decrease the chance they keep a fullback on the roster? When asked, Pete did not specifically say they were bringing back the position. Pete stated a recommitment to hard ball running into a loaded box, which supports having a fullback on the roster. But you could also make the argument that the marginal value of adding a fullback is reduced with the addition of two blocking tight ends of a similar skills. Great question. And lots to this. I think that the fact that I read somewhere they've got 4 fullbacks on the roster at the moment suggests that they are quite determined to bring it back in some form. That said, how you bring it back is important. It seems like when they had Mike Robb, they just had a fullback. He had special teams value, but more than anything, it was the value that he provided with Marshawn. And it was because he had that connection with Marshawn and Marshawn trusted him that he was an important sign. And since then, it seems to me like they've been they've almost acknowledged that you can't start, it's a waste of a roster position unless the fullback can do something else. So they've been looking for guys who can ideally provide some special teams value like Derek Coleman did, or somebody who can actually be a threat, whether that's as a runner, as a receiver, or something like that, kind of like the Marcel Reese type of fullback. And they've had issues. You know, they drafted a fullback a few years ago, didn't really make it. They've looked at various different types. They've got a few bodies in this year, and I think it's going to be a little bit of a shift. I think they might be willing to sacrifice some of the special teams brilliance and maybe some of the athleticism and the pass catching ability in order to just get back to the hardball football that you talked about there. I think there's going to be some of that. That said, if none of these guys show that they're capable or worthy of a roster spot, they might just be willing to roll with the 2 tight ends. I think I read somewhere that Brian Schottenheimer has often used tight end as a blocker, as a foot in the fullback position in certain formations, and they might be prepared for Will Disley to do that, for example. I'm not saying that he becomes a fullback or anything. It's just that on certain snaps where you want to use the fullback, you can maybe drop him back there and do that. That's a possibility. But when they drafted Rashad Penny, they must have. It's a foregone conclusion that they looked and saw him running in I formation with a fullback so often, having a lot of success there, trusting his leader in front. That I think they will want to incorporate some of that again, and I'm all for it. You know, if they're going to play an old school style, play an old school style. So I think that we are going to see a fullback on the roster. It's just who and whether they can justify the value there. But I think it's a great question, and one that football nerds like us will want to get into, and I think it's going to be an interesting thing to follow. Jim Q says, Rob, did you see any evidence of regional bias or East Coast bias in the rankings of players this year? It seems somewhat obvious to me that lesser players from the East were perhaps valued higher based on the fact that they had a lot of games on TV out East and were better known commodities regardless of their talent. Specifically, I'm referring to Rashad Penny, who had one hell of a year statistically, and yet some of the draft graders admitted to not seeing any Penny tape or only watching a game or two. Was that not an example of regional bias? Back east, I'm sure the general opinion is that San Diego State University is a school for surfers who have to battle against wild Indians every day and is certainly not a football powerhouse. In my opinion, a lot of the draft experts just aren't doing their jobs properly or very well. I think there's a bit of that. You know, I'm not going to trash anybody, but, you know, just to give one example, one of the more high-profile draft analysts, you know, openly admits, you know, come the end of the year that he hasn't seen tape on certain players, even though he does grades and rankings. Some of the draft experts, for example, will quite generally get into certain players later in the process. I mean, look how, for example, Daniel Jeremiah's top 50 changes so much. And, you know, off the back of things like the Senior Bowl and the Combine, I'm not sure that teams change too much there. Maybe there's little tiebreakers, but they kind of probably anticipate certain things. So I do think maybe there was, you know, Rashad Penny maybe deserves some more attention purely because of the way he produced. Nations leading Russia, obviously has ended up going in the first round, and maybe teams should have been more aware of that. That said, I kind of understand it as well. I mean, it's unless you're doing it full time, you know, maybe the full time guys haven't got an excuse. If you're not doing it for, it's hard to get to everybody. This was a really deep running back class. There are more high profile games to watch. It was very, I mean, Georgia went on the TV nearly every week. So were Alabama and Auburn over here in the United Kingdom, where we get a lot of SEC football. Very easy to watch the running backs like Nick Chubb, Sonny Michel, Kerryon Johnson, Darius Guice, people like that. Not quite as easy to see San Diego State, and you do have to do a bit more digging. You know, so I kind of see that as, in terms of East Coast bias. I think there is some of that. I think it's also a little bit understandable just because of the time that the games start over in the West Coast, over in the East Coast. If you to stay up and watch San Diego State, if you've even got access to them on the East Coast because they might not be on the TV, you're talking really late in the evening. So I think there's probably a little bit of that as well. But I think sometimes that's perhaps a little bit. People are criticised for that harshly because it is, you know, you stay up till 10 o'clock at night to watch Rashad Penny. It's a hard sell for some of the East Coast people, I would imagine. DCD2 says, apart from Seattle, whose drafts did you like the most or the least? The two that I kind of like the most, I think, in general, New York Giants love their first 4 picks, you know, to get Saquon and Will Hernandez, really repair the running game there, come back and get Lorenzo Carter and BJ Hull. Just love that as a quartet. And I imagine the New York Giants have got a great chance of being really competitive in the NFC because of their draft this year. Like Cincinnati's as well, I think the way that they added talent in various different rounds, I think the Bengals had their best draft in many, many years. So I really like those two classes. I also like what Tampa Bay did, trading down to get Vita Vea, getting those 2 extra second-round picks, also getting Ronald Jones a second. I think that was a good draft from Tampa Bay. One of the drafts that I didn't like, wasn't crazy about San Francisco's. Don't mind the McGlinchey pick, just not, he's never a player that I kind of personally felt you would want to take in the top 10. And, you know, is he ever going to be a future left tackle? Is he just a right tackle? Don't think he could be a guard. So some reservations there. And I think after that, as much as I like Dante Pettis, you know, is he going to be a big time X factor at the next level? Or is he going to be somebody who contributes in and out? Again, he could be Paul Richardson, or he could be a bit of a non-factor. I wasn't crazy about San Francisco's draft. Wasn't crazy about Green Bay's, the way that they just obsessed about the secondary and didn't address other areas. And I wasn't a big fan of New Orleans moving up and drafting Marcus Davenport. I really like Davenport as a player. Spending your second 2 first-round picks, though, to go and get him seemed like it was almost a bit too bold from New Orleans. So we'll see how that one pans out. And he goes on to ask for suggestions for offensive rookie of the year and defensive rookie of the year. I suppose the early favourite for defensive one will be Chubb, just because he's playing across from Von Miller. Will get plenty of opportunity to get sacks. In terms of offensive rookie of the year, I think Saquon has got as good a chance as anybody. If the Seahawks can run the ball, and if Rashad Penny ends up being a feature runner, then he will be in contention with that. I think the fact that he may be competing or working with Chris Carson might work against him. Saquon's not going to have that kind of competition in New York. So I think Saquon is probably the safe money's on him. Let's try and get through a few more of these. C-Mode says, any interesting league-wide draft trends you noticed, particularly this year, whether the Seahawks are showing themselves to be ahead of the curve, right on it, or behind it in certain aspects? I think that the league-wide trend is, again, it's just the importance of the quarterback position and finding your guy. You know, teams being more aggressive to go and get their guys this year. We saw trades up again for quarterbacks, but the price went down. And like last year, you were sort of seeing like multiple first-round picks being surrendered to go and get Patrick Mahomes and people like that, Deshaun Watson. This year, teams like Arizona were able to move up for like a third-round pick to go and get Josh Rosen, and the Bills being able to move up for what they did. It didn't give up quite as much as other teams have in the past. So I felt that was quite an interesting trend there, because I was expecting the big, bold moves up, and they actually got discounted moves on some of these quarterbacks, which was a bit surprising given the dearth of quarterbacks that are going to be in the draft next year. They're just not going to be a good quarterback draft next year. So I was a little bit surprised about that. And as for the Seahawks, I think it kind of just shows that they're being who they are, being true to themselves. I don't know if it's a trend or not. I think it's just they're being who they need to be. And, I think whether teams copy that or not, and whether other teams are going to mimic them or not really concerned as long as they do what they do well. And the Seahawks tried to play old school football when the league was drifting towards Aaron Rodgers against Big Ben in the Super Bowl in 2010 and throwing it all over the place. And the Seahawks came in and did old school football and won a Super Bowl. Everybody tried to copy that. It's kind of drifted more towards that passing game again. And we hear all these people on Twitter saying that the running game doesn't matter anymore. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Seahawks set a new trend now and teams try and copy them as they go back to that sort of old school style. Ishmael says, this might be a bit too much of a call out to answer, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on fandom and the emerging process truthers in football. We've seen all offseason a bunch of people who are desperate to trade Wilson, Earl, and now the latest target of their affections is Bobby Wagner. If you've got any general thoughts around team building regarding this, I'd be interested. I think... I think fans like draft picks and they like to talk about that. I always have a saying that players are better than draft picks. If you've got good players, they're better than having good draft picks, because, I mean, look, the Browns have had the best draft stock in the league for years and have not done anything with it. So, players better than picks. That said, I also think it's best to know if you can get out a year too early and do what the Patriots have done, then I think that's the thing to do. And the Patriots don't get everything right. Look at Chandler Jones. They moved him on for a second-round pick. He's been one of the best pass rushers in the NFL since. Probably should have gone first round of him. And I think sometimes you've got to know what the value is. And if it's better to lose a player a year early, maybe for like a second or third rounder, than have a pretty average year out of them and then lose them for nothing in a year's time. So I think there is some sort of management there. I think in terms of the Seahawks, if they don't want to give Earl a third contract, I understand that, but I really don't want to see them losing for nothing in a year's time. And if that happens, that will be as unpalatable as losing for like a second or third rounder this year. I don't think Bobby's going to go anywhere. I think they love him. I think they see him as this kind of, I think they view him as a special player. And I think they're right. I mean, look at the way that he's played for the last couple of years. And I think with Russell, again, I think they're going to end up paying it. Might be a franchise tag when his contract expires, but I think he's just such a player that, and it's so hard to find these players, and for the Seahawks to find one now, I don't think you give that up easily. So I think you keep the core of the team. I hope they can do something with Earl. I hope there's a process with Earl that can enable him to stay with the Seahawks till the end of his career. But let's just wait and see what happens there. EP says, is there any other veteran free agents left in the market that the Seahawks might target? I think we've addressed that already. Nobody that springs to mind, EP. No freaking clue says the commitment to re-establishing the running game is unmistakable. Are we necessarily sacrificing the ability to hit the explosive play by doing so? Or does it just change what it means to hit a big play, in the sense that a so-called big play doesn't have to mean a big gain or a wide receiver or a tight end? It could also mean a running back screen or a running back shifting out wide after starting in the I formation. I think that explosive plays are something that's like, like a 15, 20-yard pass or like a 12-yard run or something like that. That's the explosive plays that you're talking about. And I think the Seahawks want to run it up, and then play action and hit you deep. and that's just classic football. And they've always taken the shots. Since Russell Wilson came in, they've always taken shots downfield, trying to look for that big play. I think it's going to be kind of an Air Coryell system. If you Google it, if you're not aware of it, it will explain what I think the Seahawks are going to do this year, and it will involve some downfield throws to the receivers. It will also be some very old school, tough, hard nosed running, and I think it's the kind of style that I want to see my team play. I'm glad that the Seahawks play it, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it works this year. But I think explosive plays can come in many, many different ways. But I still think we will see some of the classic Carroll shots downfield that he's like to have when he's been in Seattle. TC Hawks, is there a linebacker in the undrafted free agent group that has a chance to make the 53? Yes, I think Pugh at Florida State, we've talked about that. Jacob Pugh is somebody that's got a real chance to do it. Kenny Sloth says, Rob, now that the draft season is over, could you give us some ideas and tips from your scouting style? I don't think I've talked about this a little bit in the past. I don't feel like I do anything different or remarkable to anybody else. I think that one thing I have is time and a very patient wife, and she allows me to record. We get about 5, 6, 7, 8 games some weekends of college football on UK TV over here, and I'll just record the lot and I will watch them. Over 2 or 3 days I'll watch the whole lot. And then in the evenings, I will spend a lot of time just sort of working on the blog, sort of watching players, crafting articles and stuff like that. And when you put as much time as you do in, as kind of I do from August through to May, you kind of just, you do sort of you work things out, and you kind of see what players are about, and you kind of find what you're looking for in certain players. And I don't think it's necessarily any kind of skill or method. It's just putting in the hours and sort of just watching players and having the time to do it. And I'm very lucky because I have a work situation that enables me to do that. I have a wife that enables me to do that. I can balance. I found a way to sort of balance the family and having 2 kids and the work and still doing this. And that's kind of what's enabled me to do it, rather than sort of any kind of technique or system. And I don't think I have any particular amazing insight or anything like that, or like an eye for things. I think it's just a case of putting in the time, and I just love doing it. I hope that you enjoy the draft coverage that we provide on Seahawks Draft Blog. There isn't another team in the NFL who has a draft blog like we do, and I just think it's cool that the Seahawks have that, and I fully intend to keep doing this blog for a long time to come. Char says, or CHA says, as it stands now, post-draft but pre-minicamp, which position group has the greatest need at the moment? I think that's defensive line. I just think they need more pass rushers there, more pass rushers that you can actually sort of see a long-term future with. There's a lot of question marks there. In a year's time, that could be a completely different situation, but I guess you can never have too many pass rushers. So I think pass rush front 7 is probably the biggest need at the moment. He says, Kazan, who can you project as the gunners on punt coverage? I think there's a good chance that Nico Thorpe will still have a role there, and I also think Shaquem Griffin's got a big chance to do that. And he finishes with ET not being traded, where do you think things stand? Still think there's a possibility of a trade down the line. Kind of want to move on from it personally, but I do think there is a chance that Dallas have not done anything at free safety, and the stalemate that was going on leading up to the draft just kind of continued through the draft. Nobody blinked. So when it gets to training camp, is Earl going to hold out? If he does, that's a bit of a power play on his behalf. That might force the Seahawks' hand. As it gets closer to the season, Dallas then starts, we want to get Earl in here and have him working with us before the season begins. If it's going to happen, it's probably going to be around that time. So I still think there is a chance that he could end up in Dallas, but personally, I'd like nothing more right now than to come up with a reasonable deal, contract extension, and just forget about it forever. Because he's a great player, he's a Seahawks great, and I hate to be sort of talking about him moving on for as long as we have. I would love to just get on with focusing on the football now, but I'm afraid I think Char or CHA is kind of called it. Where do we stand? Well, we're still talking about it, and until he either signs that new contract, leaves as a free agent next year, or is traded somewhere, it's going to be a talking point. Seb says, Shaquem's move to weak side linebacker confuses me. If his strength at UCF was making plays at outside linebacker, why change things? Is it a move to replace KJ Wright next year? Well, in fairness, he did line up in a very similar position that KJ lines up in for UCF. You know, you do see examples of that. And you want him flying to the ball, you want him spying, you want him blitzing, you want him attacking the line of scrimmage. You know, that's really what he is. He's an attack dog, really, on in terms of pass rush and getting to the ball. He's incredibly relentless and energetic and very, very talented. And I do think that I know people wanted to see him sort of Sam Leo, others wanted to see him maybe safety. I do think that is going to be his best position, so that weak side. He has to improve his zone coverage. That is one area that he has to get better at. Zone coverage at times is not very good at all. His awareness in zone just misses and allows men to drift off and doesn't cover them. You know, that's an area he's going to have to improve. But in terms of flying to the ball, being a pass rusher, being a spy, he's very, very good at that. Last couple of questions. KD says, one of the knocks on Penny is that he's not a great blocker. With a recommitment to the running game, do you think Carroll will also recommit to the use of a fullback? So yeah, I kind of talked about this already. Fullback, yeah, I can see a commitment to that moving forward. And as for not being a great blocker, I think Penny needs to work on it. But again, every rookie running back needs to, except Zeke Elliott, who was perfect at that. Everybody else needs to do a lot of work on it. And Georgia Hawk says, which rookie is likely to make the most impact year one? A Seahawks rookie of the year, if you will. However unlikely it is, would the Hawks truly consider cutting Dixon if he loses a battle to Ryan in training camp? Well, there are many candidates. I guess Shaquem Griffin, with his attitude and his athleticism and everything, he could potentially be rookie of the year. If Penny takes over the lead running back role, then he's in with a great chance of that. I mean, Will Disley, I can see contributing in year one, and Dixon himself, if he's the starting punter and quickly becomes one of the best punters in the NFL, then he's a potential rookie of the year. As for cutting Dixon, if he loses the battle in training camp, I think it will take something special from John Ryan, because you've got to think long term. If Ryan wins the battle this year, is one more year of John Ryan better than maybe 4 years at a really low cost of Michael Dixon? That's the kind of thing you have to consider there. If Dixon completely looks terrible in camp and has nerves and stuff like that, and John Ryan looks great, then maybe it's a bit more palatable to do that. When the Tampa Bay Buccaneers drafted a kicker in round 2 and then cut him within a year. So, these are the kind of things you have to consider. At the same time, Dixon is an Australian. They don't often suffer with nerves and a lack of confidence. So, everything about him sounds very, very positive, and I think the expectation is that he will win that job. So that's the end of the Google Hangout. Thanks for listening. Thanks to everybody who followed the blog during the draft and before the draft and during the draft. I've been doing this blog since 2008. It'll be coming up on 10 years by the time we get into to sort of November time that I start this blog. I still absolutely love doing it, and it's mainly because of the people who contribute in the community. I've often said it that Seahawks Draft Blog is like nowhere else on the internet, really, in that you have a big group of people coming together to talk about sport, and you very rarely see arguments. You don't see bad language. You don't see loads of politics. It kind of sticks to football and on topic. And, I appreciate that. There are lots of other places you can go to if you want to talk about those other things, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, forums. And yet it's a Seahawks Draft Blog. And we generally talk about the Seahawks draft, which is what it was designed to do. So I appreciate everybody in the community. I really appreciate everybody who contributes on Patreon and continues to do that. I am going to take a bit of a break. I'm going to come back to the writing. It's not going to be the long break that I had last year because I just had a baby and needed to get back into family life. Not going to have a huge long break. We'll get back to writing very quickly. Do want to get into some of these rookies down the line and some general thoughts on the Seahawks. If there's any podcast opportunities coming up, I will take them and I will make sure I post them on the blog as well. I will tweet everything out that I do. If you need to keep an eye on that, then it's at Rob Staten for those. And again, just another thank you to everybody who's made this another really enjoyable draft season. Can't wait to do it all again. If you came to the blog between the months of January and April or May, we are not just doing this during the draft season from the end of the year. We are doing this from August, September. As soon as the college season starts, we're talking about players where we're projecting what the Seahawks needs are, trying to uncover the people who are going to make up the first round. And, it's my favorite time for the blog is September to December. It's not December to May. It's the sort of that initial while the football's going on, talking about it. So I would encourage you to get on the blog straight from training camp onwards and stick with us throughout the whole year. It really builds up from January onwards, but I'd love to see the blog as busy as it is then between September and December as well. So a final thank you. Again, appreciate you listening to this. Stay with the Seahawks Draft Blog. I am going to take a break. but we'll be back very, very soon with more draft coverage. Goodbye.